11-page stories.
Written through L.T. Zupan. Read by L.T. Zupan.
Story number 9. Fraiaraiey Tale 1 .. The fairy gasped. He turned and looked back at the whirlpool behind him on the ground. That was a near escape, and the problems of these portals was growing. The trouble was that some of them were desirable, and then others came along and disguised themselves to trick you into their vortex of Lord knows what, usually an abundance of chaos to say the least. And even fairies, granted not all of them, had their limits when it came to chaos. Sometimes the whirlpools were just plain old density, highly magnetic, once you went in them part of the way. Oh well, time to go back to his favorite tree and unpack a beverage from his rucksack. Jude was decidedly an inventor and an experimenter. He savored feelings. His most recent favorite, which he was exploring, was vulnerability. Emotions intertwined events for him, and they intersected as a confluence and a coalescence if he was lucky. He had arrived at the tree. The sky was turning purple with cyan streaks all through it. Great, more sky art, Jude thought happily. He hopped onto the main branch sticking out to the side and opened his burlap bag. He pulled out a bottle with a purple fluid swirling around inside of it. Different from the sky's purple, but equally beautiful. He pulled out his deep crystal mug, a dark turquoise, and uncorked the bottle. Ah, what a lovely time mid-dusk is, Jude said aloud to the tree. There were 6 hours for dusk, and he was correct. It was near the third of those hours. He sipped. 2 .. The tree had no name other than tree. It looked lovingly up to Jude, in the same way a dog would. Its eyes were something you couldn't see, but you could sense them if you were keen. Jude took a gulp of the drink. Time stood still momentarily. He took in the view of the foothills laid out before him, slowly descending into the plains in the distance. The grasses covering some were orange and green, while bright beige dirt was interspersed in patches where no grass would grow. He pondered ice. What a miraculous invention, or discovery. Having a solid that becomes a liquid in your cup. He wanted to have a liquid that became a solid, too. Reverse ice. But then you would need reverse freezers for that. Such a pity. His purple drink was called Nagatko, and his grandmother had given it to him earlier that week. He finished it and burped quietly. The ground had started rumbling again, and he hopped off of the tree. The small fairy stood his ground and waited. 3 .. He saw the gemmy red first of all. Saw it coming a mile away, as they say. Yes, it was the little red-haired girl again. He knew it. How he was fascinated by that one. She may have even been beginning to become his friend. If she would be his friend, that is. If he wasn't too scary, like he seemed to be to most all of the human people these days. The joy within him burst up from the stem of his spine. He could already imagine the way her eyes twinkled. He made an excited sound like an old modem. The portal grew below him on the grounds. It reached its full size and brightened. Finally, the whirlpool lifted off the ground to face him, and the ruby-red color in the center brightened and fused and sparkled and shot eensy sparks of itself in all directions. He looked at it and took his hat off and scratched his head. It always got itchy when the doorways were first opening. A raccoonish-looking fairy ran up from out of nowhere and shouted, "Jude!" stomping each of her feet on the ground. First left and then right. "Play me a song." The truculent fairy was being playful. 4 .. He pulled out a book and sat Indian style. "You don't even have your adult wings yet. I'm not doing anything for you. I am calmly reading." The little girl tapped him on the shoulder and he jumped. "You made it through!" Jude screamed. And the little redhead had. This was indeed a true rarity, very uncommon and very unforeseeable, his favorite. "I tried really, really hard this time," she said. "Who are you?" the little girl greeted the strange new fairy with this question as she turned away from Jude. "That's Trinky." "Bossy, really, but I don't care," Jude informed. "Play me a song, both of you." Trinky pelted at the redhead. "I'm Anastasia. It's Irish." The small human spoke undaunted, looking like she was going to explode with excitement. "Anastasia Green." "Got any crackers?" Trinky stuck her tongue out at Anastasia between each of her words. It wasn't mocking, though, more playful and giddy than anything else. "Trinky, I don't even have a biscuit," Anastasia said with all the charisma she had. A charisma that was more like a transparent photostatic copy of the adults in her short life, particularly her older relatives who loved to show off at expensive wine parties with faux friends. "You made it," Jude shouted again. "I'm actually just so glad that I did. Today I think your world is better than mine, but I know that's a mean thing. But it's true today, at least. So, what's going on?" She looked around and marveled as she spoke to Jude. Trinky muttered something about leaves and ran off out of sight. "Come, human girl, let's walk and talk." Jude grabbed her hand and they walked together towards the eastern blue forest. Anastasia's eyes twinkled. The portal closed as their proximity drew farther and farther away from it, but not before a large couch bug managed to crawl through. 5 ... Dusk bled onward. The blue forest had kaleidoscope trees which bore precious stones as fruit. To look at the fruit was like looking into a mirror, but a mirror that was visually more like a mirror than any earthen mirror. There were many paths in the forest, and Jude walked, seeming to not know precisely where they were going. Jude had a light green skin and was considerably smaller than Anastasia. They made good walking partners. As they walked, the forest grew thicker, and into a darker full blue as they went. "Do you want to be friends?" Jude asked. Anastasia laughed. "That already started a long time ago." "Hello?" Jude looked perplexed. "Oh, well, good," he added, and smiled. He looked like he was going to cry. "Where are we going?" she asked. "East," he said. "Oh." Now it was her turn to look blankly ahead. "Okay." The forest hummed a quiet melody as they strolled. It was underneath everything somehow, and it was like nothing the girl had ever heard. Indeed, most humans generally never have or shall. It was in the languages and tones of the great crystals. 6 ... Is fairyland as big as planet Earth, Jude? Big and small. It changes. But yes, it is way more vaster, ultimately. It has rings upon galaxies of thought, myriads of creatures, and, well, I should be brief and clear in a way that makes sense for you, actually. This world that I inhabitate and call my home is not all of fairyland. There are many, many other worlds of the fae. Some are connected, some are right beside it, and so on. Yep, etc. She smiled agreeably. Anastasia was a 7-year-old girl, and she beamed accordingly. She didn't know she was the wisest girl of her age. That was an element of her wisdom, in fact, that she would not have wanted to know or care about her identity's comparison. "Do you ever spend time doing the same thing?" Jude asked. "You know, just doing something for a really long time, and knowing that everything is solid and there's very little chaos, so nothing will probably interrupt you and you could just keep doing the same thing over and over again?" He was very awkward when he asked this. It looked as though he were stifling himself and his perhaps alien language, which he was to an extent. Now she was giggling. "That would be so boring, unless you were doing the best things in the world again and again. But then I would probably still get bored again. Do you ever do that?" "No, we can't do that here." "Do you ever get really, really sad for fun? I mean, no, not for fun, but just because you want to, and then you would really like it?" He seemed even more awkward now, which didn't seem possible a minute ago, when he was already quite extreme in that regard. I don't like to be sad. She seemed to have an understanding of the question, though. But sometimes I love something so much, it makes me really sad. And I guess that's good. Good sad. But I don't know. She smiled at him and her eyes twinkled again. That was the moment he knew that there were really no lies in her. She meant she was his friend. She was not like the other human beings. 7 dash dash dash. What's the most fun thing to do in your world? That's what I want to do right now. Where are we going? Anastasia was losing the ability to contain herself. To the most fun thing to do here. That's where. And Jude was prepared. They were not walking around at random after all, as it may have seemed. Just a little further. 5 more minutes? That's what you call them, minutes? What a great name for some little times. Minutes. Minutes. Ha! He tittered to himself and then composed himself in an absurd-looking fashion. Will you tell me more about fairies until we get there? Of course. What would you like to hear about and of? Are there scary fairies? Is there a fairy queen? Do fairies live forever? I have 1,000,000,000 questions. I wish you could go through the glass to my world. You could go soon if you could. I would play you a song on a piano. But yeah, those are some of the things I want to know. I will tell you anything about my town and my world too. All you have to do is ask me. I'm sorry if I'm too excited. My friends always say I'm too excited. Okay, I'm going to be quiet now. She couldn't stop looking around at the forest. She didn't appear terribly excited, physically. She wasn't jerking her head around or flailing her arms about. But there was an understandable nervousness to her bursting speech. Jude just listened intently until he was sure she was done, and then he went into a deep and quick contemplation of what she had asked, and of what she had offered in return. They were only a few minutes from their destination now. Jude spun around in a circle and kept walking. Anastasia copied him. Yes, there are zillions of different kinds of fairies. Way, way more than humans. This place is actually a rather tame quadrant of the many lands and worlds that there are, and all the beings you will meet here will not scare you. But yes, there are some very, very scary fairies. He almost sang the end of his last sentence. He paused and thought, and then he went on. But the scary ones have a purpose, and always remember that just because you're scared, and they are therefore scary, doesn't mean they will ever do anything to harm you. Sometimes, fear just happens, and it isn't anyone's fault. It's just a handshake, sort of. Sometimes. You're smart, she said. It doesn't matter if someone's smart, as much as matters of the heart matter, he kindly retorted. As for a fairy queen, there are many, and they aren't like the queens in your world. They are more like the barbers or the singers of your world. They are not treated as superior in the way your royalty is. Royalty? Yes, your kings and queens and presidents. Oh, are we there yet? Funny you should ask, because we are. Right around this corner. 8 dash dash dash. The blue grew purer as they turned off the wide path they had been on and went to the right down a very, very narrow path. 22 yards through some twists and turns, and they arrived at a clearing. The most complex and beautiful large 2 square feet ornament hung from the one tree in the center of the clearing. It was somewhere between bronze, burnt silver, and gold. It positively glowed. Now don't get too near it, Jude cautioned, or you'll get shrunk. Size changes when you're too close, but we can walk up to it if you want to. Anastasia led the way. She heard a faint musical buzzing coming from the intricate object as she neared it. What is it? She asked, full of marvel. A city. Well, more of a town, really. For I think you call them dragonflies? That is definitely not what we call them, but it is a funny name, so there's points for that. It was slowly rotating back and forth. Anastasia leaned forward and looked closer. 9 dash dash dash. It was like an M.C. Escher sculpture, but infinitely more complex and fragile in its construction, its beauty, and its art. Teeming throughout, Anna could see thousands of what looked like tiny, tiny little dragonflies. They were playing on spindles, Ferris wheel-esques, loop-de-loops, and the like. Some were still, others were alone. Most were socializing. She thought she could make out micro-clusters of housing, but daren't move her head closer to see. Her head was beginning to feel like a huge boulder to her, as she noticed how vast the size difference was between her and them. She stepped back when the buzzing coming from the colony started to swell. "They are done with their deliberations after all. Jude said mysteriously and playfully to the girl. The air shifted. Sparkles drifted from the honeycomb home of the so-called dragonflies, which are another breed of fae. Anastasia became entranced in the luminescence of the magic. Diamond gold and the impossible colorations blew out in pixel bursts, all around the hive, the nest, the center of the clearing. Nearly 100 points of it transfixed them both, although this obviously wasn't technically a new thing for Jude, the crafter fairy. The space around the dragonfly's home, the space itself, along with all the sparkle points, imploded back to a single central point in the nest, which was off-center but centralized. The point brightened from its beginning as a bright white point of light, much like the portal from earlier in our story, and then flashed visually quiet. A buzz from a half-mile radius of the aura, or auric field, of this thing in this clearing mirrored what the points of magic light had done, and sonic boomed back to the same single point, replacing the image flash. Out of that near-deafening event came a mellowing of all senses, and an itsy-bitsy black dot. 10 ... The black dot held Anastasia's gaze. So slowly, a genesis of stature growth came to the scene. The dot flew nearer and got bigger as it did. It was a near-microscopic world where a speck was traveling across what would be a grand canyon of distance to us, and the very scale of the reality changed as it journeyed nearer, turning lightning into a snail. Anastasia had never imagined anything like it, not in all of her fantasticalist of dreams. "This is rad," she whispered, but not in spite of herself. And from its breakneck speeds, when it got near to the standing girl, it halted in an instant and hovered. What was before her was divine. She knew it instantly, and in the way that only a little human red-headed earth girl could. A true witch's red hair, that is, regardless of how nothing is limited by gender and of how gender limits everything, regardless of any opinions of frogs and spiders, forearms and soup, ramen and typewriters, prophecy, those ahead of time, woofers and Kurt Cobain, beauty orchids versus grand roses, the like. She just knew. God damn it. Excuse my France, which I love. She knew. Not like it was overdramatic or anything. It could look into her soul. To illustrate, it was like a quantum jump beyond the word it, to begin with, obviously, an admixture or composite of, well, imagine you were you, and notice the purest and uttermost sacred and rare and few of the best emotions or raptures you've ever felt in your existence, and then imagine you grew beyond that, so as that those few bests flourished out in a cone-shaped way or fashion, which afforded or accorded each of those few bests, turning into a multiplicity of themselves, and then hunkering into various arrays of subtleties and subsets, so that you used to have a rare red and a rare purple that was somehow better than your perfects you had thought you'd known before, but then those reds and purples blew out into a palette of cyans, magentas, 5 kinds of yellows and whites and grays and pinks, etc., etc. And then you found that you could take these newly evolved palettes, sprung from your best raptures, and use them as tools for interactions with others, and for experience within yourself, in any order. That was what this being was born already knowing how to do. It was enough to make you not weep, but maybe gush, in some emotional kind of way, at the phases after the inception of interaction married with revelation or realization. All of this, mind you, Anna instinctively knew. She could tell you about it much more eloquently than I could, actually. Of that I am sure. Ah, but I digress. Moving on, as they say, the phrase, as they say, hey, 11 dash dash dash. Its body was a super bright blue. The heart of this forest it does hold. It seemed a ballet in its stance, and turn hovering into a poem of movement. Its face smiled. It stood upright in the air, and had a very thin and curvaceous little woman's body. All of the suppleness, all of the beauty, and the consequent feelings of beauty, and then some. Yet the sexuality was intentionally muted at the time. The fairy seemed years beyond all of that kind of stuff, in a strange, not simple at all sort of way. Her wings also held memories and capacity, everything that is needed for what shall appear before her. A mystery of canopy, a changing floral trace of designry, a love of the hate of adverbs, actually, among other things, a cure among other things. The female dragonfly fairy spoke to Anastasia. You may call me by a name if you wish. For now, Bhakti. Anastasia openly gawked. Time went by. Time during which no one around there cared how long it wanted to take. Are you a fairy godmother? The sweet child asked. Jude remained silent, as was his common tact. Closer, she said, as she spoke through to the core of Anastasia's soul. Much transpired from her speech, much more than the typical deliberation of verbal dance. Ripples from every sound. Closer than when you called me queen before, when you were walking with Jude. But don't be mistaken. Queen is an absolutely lovely word. Royalty, not as much. You must be Anna. I am, and I wish I had a piano so I could play a song for you. The red in your hair alone is a song I see. Through your mind, from your spirit, and into the strands. Pretty is the word, a word that needs more care for it. But you don't need more. You sing. You sing more than you've seen. That is why I remain your humble servant queen of the so-called everythings. I don't want to go home, Anastasia complained. You shall go wherever you love. The Queen of the Fairies replied.